My life work for the last 6 years has been to try to create a market infrastructure that can be owned fully and operated fully and governed fully by the supply side of this carbon and biodiversity and sort of living capital marketplace.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Gregory Landaway from Regen Network. In this discussion, we get into the history of Regen Network, Gregory's deep green background, and what's led him to the blockchain space. Gregory draws the parallel between water and money and asks, how do we drive change from the top of the watershed? We go into the philosophical underpinnings of the carbon markets and Gregory's response to the main critiques that are often levied against them. We go into foundational ideas around money, crypto, ecological credits, governance, and more. Ultimately, what this is about is how do we rebalance and harmonize our relationship between humans and the greater than human world. This conversation was recorded at the Eco Weaving Gathering in Wilbur, California in April 2023. Let's dive right in with Gregory Landaway. Welcome. Today we're here with Gregory Landaway. Gregory is the co-founder of Regen Network. Welcome, Gregory.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. We're here at Wilbur Hot Springs at the Eco Weaving Gathering. How's it going for you?
It's great. Yeah. Very spontaneous and lots of very competent and committed people coming together. Mm-hmm. And it's beautiful to have that kind of moment held in nature and the beautiful hot springs. And so I'm feeling very blessed.
Nice. And I've been excited about this interview because, you know, a lot of the context of this series is around the intersection between crypto, Web3, and climate, nature, finance. And, you know, Regen Network is really the OG of OGs in this space, as far as I can tell, and as far as I've been watching for many years. Like, you've been one of the very leading early voices in bringing these worlds together. I mean, how many years in now? 5 years, 6 years in?
Yeah, like 6 years. So Regen Network was founded in May of 2017. Mm-hmm. So whatever that puts us at, coming up on just about 6 years. Yeah, and before that, you know, also I and the partners who came together to co-found Regen Network were also kind of working in this larger space around regenerative economics, regenerative agriculture, regenerative supply. But at that time, before 2017, we hadn't chosen to sort of take the leap and we hadn't become crypto pilled, I guess. Right. So 2017, there was really a threshold where we decided to have it, to do an experiment to see.
Because you had written a book about economics.
Yeah, regenerative economics. We called it Regenerative Enterprise V1. Was published in late 2012, early 2013, I think.
And you also ran a permaculture consulting group?
Yeah. So at that time, what I was doing as a vocation was consulting and design, with a permaculture lens, but really quite focused at the business level, enterprise design. So we were doing farm planning or sort of So the side note is it's very hard to make money in today's economy while regenerating landscapes.
Yeah, noticed.
Because, you would know. You would know with all of your work in New Zealand, you really, just because of the way the whole global economy is structured, the shift from monoculture and scale to polyculture, diversity, smaller scale, you need more human input costs, you need more human ingenuity and creativity.
Right.
You can rely much less on just sort of disposability, scale, petroleum inputs, because none of those things they're efficient, but none of them are effective at the cycles of regeneration that a landscape is asking for from humans. So we really focused our energy in those days, and this was the time that I had co-founded Terragenesis International and was using that as sort of my vocational vehicle, doing this type of work, consulting, design, trying to be as strategic as possible. So we were really trying to pick clients and projects that had the largest landscape scale regeneration potential, and also clients that we felt had sort of social regeneration potential, where someone going through a multi-year process dedicated to relearning how to be in relationship with a place and then build businesses from that place that ended up increasing soil health, increasing biodiversity, repairing watersheds, that the people going through that process, that's a transformative process. When you go through that, as you know, when you go through that process for many years, you come out having a different embodied sense of what it is to be human, and what's right and what's good and what's beautiful starts to evolve away from this sort of abstracted aesthetic of consumerism and where status is tied up with sort of the shiny objects that are easily pumped out at scale through extractive industry. And I think my experience is the minds and hearts of people who are really engaged in those sorts of regenerative processes in a place start to evolve quite a bit. And so there was a theory of change there, that combination, that intersection of landscape regeneration and the transformation that humans, in our case, clients, whether that's an individual or a business, going through a process of inquiry and learning about how to regenerate a landscape and a set of relationships with other humans and businesses around that as a goal, could be a pretty powerful engine for transformation.
Yeah. It reminds me of there's a couple different communities in New Zealand I'm close to. One of them, their kind of motto or go-to is, if you heal the land, you heal yourself, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And another is people who build the house are built by the house. It's like this reciprocal, reflexive relationship.
Yeah. And the earth is our body, and our bodies are the earth. Is a teaching.
So usually people from the outside of this crypto world, if they have more of an environmental background, let's say, they might perceive this space as being characterized by a lot of, forgive me, tech bros, people that might have a capitalistic financial, understanding of the world, and that they're moving into this kind of hot, fast, loose, refi, regenerative finance space. I'm painting crude, broad generalizations, but I think that's been my experience in speaking to people who are a bit skeptical of the Web3 space as a solution set for ecological coordination. And I think what your background and your context and your understanding brings is much more of a deep green permaculture, experienced understanding of conservation, restoration, landscape scale understanding, and then you get crypto pilled.
Yeah. Crazy, right? Well,
unexpected for 2016, 2017 as well. I mean, what were you seeing around the corner and what do you still see?
So the context there is, I've always been really fascinated with money, economics, finance, money. This is sort of a side note to get into your question. I've long believed, or had an intuition, maybe is a better way of putting it, that money is something like the root protocol of society, of a particular society. I've also long believed that different societies from different places with different relationships with landscape and different relationships with one another and different relationships with outside clearly are going to have different types of money, different expectations of what it means, where the symbol is derived from. And if you look back, David Graeber's last book before he passed, The Dawn of Everything, and some of his previous work as well, does an amazing job at sort of like opening up the spectrum of creative possibility of human societies experimenting with, or experimenting is not the right word, evolving culture and the role of some symbolic representation that allows people to coordinate when you get past sort of like a family or a clan scale. So there's just this thing that, we have to start to create these abstract symbolic processes that are tied to culture. And that's part of what money is. Money is, it's a collective hallucination. It's a figment of our imagination. It's also deeply connected with a set of cultural assumptions. So why blockchain? In 2017, I had been tracking Bitcoin as a money geek. I'd been tracking Bitcoin since Satoshi released the white paper. I think I came across it in 2009. I don't actually know what date I'm not that geeky. Like I wasn't in the channels, but I read the white paper and, I was fascinated for three reasons. I was fascinated that there was an experiment in a fixed supply unit of account. I think that's really interesting and cool. And
21 million Bitcoins.
Right.
That's the maximum.
And that's the maximum they'll ever be.
Right.
Of course, that's a social construct, because if everybody got together, of all the Bitcoin miners got together and changed the code, they could actually change the code. But that would be this arduous process, and there's this philosophical core to like this experiment where they don't want inflation of the monetary supply.
Right.
I should say an increase of the monetary supply, because they're worried that may cause inflation of prices. That's interesting. I think that's cool. I'm a big fan of people experimenting outside of the hallowed halls of ivory tower yuckety yucks who went to some university and think that they know things. My experience is that's not where wisdom and change and regeneration is born out of. That's been my direct experience. My direct experience is there's a huge amount of wisdom held in the hands of farmers and foresters and just people out in the world that like have a direct relationship with the planet. And you sort of, in a way, and this is a bias, and I don't 100% believe what I'm about to say, but in a way, I think you get dumber and dumber the farther you get from those sorts of relationships. So you get into these, into the, metaphorical ivory tower in some university somewhere, and you have all this power and you have all this prestige and you've read a lot of books, and then you generate these theories that become law or regulatory strategy or monetary strategy, and it's quite disconnected from reality.
I think that's the word for me that comes up, is like disconnection. The more we become disconnected and abstracted, the less in touch we are with what's really going on. Doesn't mean that the theory is not important and the abstraction,
and that there's something very interesting. Totally. And so getting back to Bitcoin, I'm just like, oh, that's so cool. Somebody's doing a fixed unit of supply monetary experiment. Awesome. Number two, it's quite cool to me to to be experimenting with what backs value. This is a different culture. It's coming from a different culture. Bitcoin represents a different culture.
Yeah.
That's why there's such a culture clash, like for better or worse, and there's critiques and other things. It represents a different culture that has different perception of how to responsibly back value. Right? And in the Bitcoin culture, you could responsibly back power by like proof of compute, proof of work, where you have computers that are provably running to create security and these sort of emergent properties of a decentralized monetary system with fixed units of account.
Right.
So back then I was like, oh, this is very interesting.
I think too, this culture and the history of cryptography
is super fascinating,
crazy fascinating.
And I've been really more like 2017, I started to kind of fall in love a little bit with the cypherpunk history and like the stories of sort of the fight between open source cryptography and trying to get that technology to people to protect their information, and the fight with the state around that. And it's just fascinating, right? It's interesting. It's an interesting story. So I've been interested, but from this is a cool experiment, not from I ideologically and philosophically believe that, for instance, like a fixed unit of supply monetary system is the way.
Totally.
Right? Because I'm skeptical of that. I think it's a cool experiment, though. So I'm not so skeptical that I'm dismissive of it and think that it's stupid. It could be right.
Yeah.
It's just different from my instincts. Right, around flexibility and growth and evolution of things. It's like that immutable story just doesn't quite match my sense of reality. Yeah. But it's interesting. It's cool. So it has something intrinsically fascinating to me. Okay. So in 2017, something started happening, and that was the ICO boom. Also, something happened for me personally, which is I took paternity leave to welcome my first son into the world. And I had, swiped my credit card through a Coinbase account and had some Bitcoin and some Ethereum from like 2015 or something. So I had newfound time. I wasn't project managing regenerative projects. I had a new son. I was taking long walks. I was thinking a lot. And I was actually thinking a lot about what am I going to do to, what am I going to do to protect and, give a livable world to my son and his future children, and having this crisis of feeling like the theory of change around large-scale landscape regeneration and bringing influential people or companies through regenerative processes. And there had been, there's a whole story there around Terrigenous, but I won't go into. I was feeling that was falling short. That there's this scale of the machine, the extractive, degenerative machine, whatever we call it, is Wetiko or, there's almost this, Charles Eisenstein talks about the, sort of emergent phenomena of, there's almost beings that are like running things. Mulak. Kevin Owaki talks about Mulak, and it's, let's call it Mulak. But there's this entity that's just sort of like, that humans are paying homage to with their approach to how the world works, like how money and finance. And I was like, man, it is good. It's intrinsically good and important and part of a strategy to have regenerative places and nodes that are transformational and rooted and really embodying and evolving. There's no doubt of that. But I started to feel like it's so easy to have those just get swept away in these larger events and these larger trends. So I started, and, again, sorry, I'm meandering all over.
That's great.
But early in my career, I was inspired by this movie called The Upward Spiral. I highly recommend everybody watch it. Be patient. It's a slow movie. It's not like Avatar or something. It's a guy in Northern California who, it's like a home video, who makes a video of himself repairing a watershed over the course of a year. And he does these experiments way down low in the watershed where it's really eroding. And, when it rains, the water's just ripping soil out and just charging down and flowing down the landscape. And, he tries to intervene, like put some rocks there or try to dam it or try to slow it down somewhere. Well, it turns out if you intervene that far down the flow, it's hopeless at that point.
Right.
You need concrete and machinery and, and even then, if you're intervening in the flow of a stream, the Army Corps of Civil Engineers of the United States can tell you, like, they waste billions of dollars putting up things that just get swept out. So he gradually goes up and up and up the watershed until he's at the very top of the hill. And he's got a tiny little trowel. And he's just, you can see in these beautiful hills in California, you can see the runnels start to form really high and, where the erosion starts to take place. And he's just going there and he's just making these little sort of like keyline swales with his hand so that the water runs out and sinks into the soil. And he's doing it just like a guy with a trowel. So it's this beautiful video of him going up the watershed and finding the top of the watershed and then intervening there.
Nice.
With this elegant, beautiful, and he does it. And then all of a sudden he's showing you there's no longer this crazy, there's like a steady flow. It's no longer this crazy erosive, flood, right? And, so this is permaculture wisdom, right? And so I started asking myself, how is that metaphor inviting me to think about where the top of the watershed is? Where could I, have a metaphorical trowel and just be sitting there sort of like in a Zen gardening bliss and like making little interventions that actually slow the flow of water. And in this case, so that's the story. Now let's transpose that and use it as a metaphor to expand. Water, from where I'm coming from, water is a really powerful analog to money. Liquidity, people are always talking about liquidity. Currency, there's currents, right? Water is, in a way, people get very fixated on carbon, and we can go into that later in the conversation, but water is really the cooling apparatus. It's what gives life. It's like when you combine water and carbon, it's what creates life. And so water, the similarities of water and money. If you have too much water, it's a flood and things die. If you have too much money, people get unhappy and they kill themselves essentially with overconsumption, all these diseases of the West, in quotes. There's all of these things that happen. You get sort of inundated and flooded. If water is moving very fast across a landscape in large volumes, it erodes soil. It just flows everything out to the giant liquidity pool at the bottom, the ocean, causing eutrophication and dead zones like that.
If water stays stagnant, look what happens versus if it's flowing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same is true with money. You can see it in all of these different forms. And so in my mind, I have this image, I have this living image of a landscape. And, my approach to, I guess you could say, monetary theory is sink it, slow it, spread it. Brock Dolman's famous, this is how you deal with water.
Yeah.
Right. So
Brock Dolman from Occidental Arts and Ecology.
Amazing permaculture teacher here in California. So and again, just to land this for listeners, viewers, if you can just imagine the difference between a torrential downpour and a denuded landscape that has no trees, no grass, and is steep, and that water comes and it just washes the soil away, and it creates these deep gullies, and they get deeper and deeper, and it just unzips the landscape, and all of that sediment goes out to the ocean, and it doesn't do any good there. It just creates turbidity and nutrient dead zones, and it clogs up all the mollusks, and it just doesn't, the ocean doesn't really want all of that. I mean, eventually it metabolizes it and it's all good, but it's not good in the short term. Imagine the same landscape with a torrential downpour that is covered in a luxuriant, beautiful forest, in which there's keyline catchments. So the same amount of water, this is the interesting thing, is the same amount of water, the same volume of water makes it to the ocean. It just makes it the pulses aren't as big. It doesn't just all run out at once. There'll be a big pulse and it'll move, but it's much smaller volume because much more is being absorbed by the landscape. And then that landscape has a hydrological pump process and is watering itself, and springs start to come up. The waterways are safe for fish and other things because it's not super turbid. The water is clean and fresh. So, okay, back to money. I think that's at least for me, that is my guiding image for money design. And getting back to blockchain, really it came down to, in that moment in my life, I was not a person of enormous wealth or prestige. I had to fund my paternity leave with GoFundMe, for instance. I had to crowdsource from my community the space to be with my kid and my wife to sort of welcome him into the world. So it was attractive to me to be experimenting. Also in permaculture, we love the edges, right? So for many reasons, it was attractive to me to be experimenting at the edges. So my instinct wasn't, and really has never been, to go try to do the performative process to get a fancy degree and to find myself into some position of power in the ivory tower and then try to, create change from that place. It's instead been to find the niche at the edge, to go up that metaphorical watershed and just sort of start experimenting and getting to work. So blockchain became very fascinating to me because we see the Overton window opening. And all of these humans, mostly millennials, mostly guys, but it's also quite diverse. And the community has gotten much more diverse since 2017. But just all of these people experimenting and asking questions and trying to reinvent financial theory and economic theory and monetary theory through a computational perspective, like using computer science to do so. So I found that was very interesting and intersected with, my instincts. At that time, especially, there were instincts and intuition around the big question that Regen Network is trying to answer, which is, how do you responsibly and effectively link currency, monetary systems, and financial systems with ecological health?
Right.
To make it so that there is an intrinsic and evolving connection between the human economy and the greater than human world. That's the big question set that we've been working on at Regen Network. And in 2017, this just like the opportunity space for design thinking was very large. So that's the how I came to think that blockchain was a worthwhile place to focus attention, coming from a very sort of deep ecology, permaculture, regenerative movement building, and and frankly, like working with co-ops and farmers associations and smallholder farmers, like very much coming from, I think, what most people would perceive. I don't love the political labels, but most people would perceive my sensibilities and aesthetic and my work career up until blockchain as being more of like a community organizer from the, in quotes, left side of the spectrum than, and it's sort of like a social entrepreneur sort of like archetype, right? So very much not coming, as you mentioned, not coming with blockchain.
You weren't a gamer. You weren't
I wasn't a gamer.
Hardcore libertarian.
I wasn't a hardcore libertarian.
Cyberpunk.
None of, and nor was I like a Silicon Valley tech startup entrepreneur. So I was like ecological and social entrepreneur who had been successfully running businesses, doing real change work, but not with an eye to like profit, with an eye to having enough resource flow to like get the people together to reconnect into a regenerative process.
Totally. Right? I hate all of these labels that we have to like, and I even just like don't even like the way that I framed that question earlier about like, well, you weren't this, and like, but it's so challenging in this moment in 2023 at times for people's early perceptions about either crypto or Web3 or environmentalism or whatever that gets in the way of actually being able to get into the discourse. And I think what I'm trying to get across in that line of inquiry, or in that kind of contrasting your background from maybe what people perceive, at the outside, is that there's stuff here to actually look at and talk about. There's a there, and that if we can actually just give it a bit more of a closer examination, which let's do so in this conversation, that there's a lot of substantive, exciting, interesting, novel, new mechanisms, technologies, layers of ways that we can think about value and coordination in new combinations, and both in a remembering as well as kind of a forward-looking, context.
Absolutely. And I think, so let's just talk about what blockchain is for a moment.
Yeah.
Blockchain, people get fixated on like blockchain is Bitcoin, or blockchain is libertarian, or blockchain is DeFi, or blockchain is NFTs. Blockchain is the birth of social computing. That's what it is. So you have personal computers that got networked together on the internet, but there was no all of the social governance and social agreements between people was happening in the non-digital space. So you have a corporate, a company might own a computer, or a company, you're working for a company and you have a login credential to manage the network or whatever. But all of the agreements are happening off of the computer. And this is sort of true with money too, right? All of the agreements that underpin the monetary system and the financial system are all, contracts and counterparty agreements that sometimes just have a very simple digital representation, but they're all just being issued by an issuer and they're responsible for it. And they just have a computer and they keep that computer safe. And that's their responsibility, right? And blockchain is the birth of the social computer by applying cryptography and creating a distributed compute network that has a set of rules that the network can govern. And in the case of Bitcoin, there's a set of rules. It's like there's a fixed supply. You can, you have this simple set of rules that create a fixed supply monetary system that's decentralized and has no central issuer. But you can also use blockchain technology to do a million things that are not financial speculation. You can use it to create a community governance and voting system. You can use it to secure data that's needed for a set of counterparties to understand how to manage their common pool resources, where those counterparties may have incentives to cheat, and therefore want to create sort of a transparent digital system to hold each other accountable for management of that common pool resource. So, and what's really interesting is you get this sort of full stack of technology, of the digitization, the ability to experiment with the digitization of our social contracts with one another, our economic contracts with one another, our governance contracts with one another. And that's like the promise or the opportunity. And that's where there's going to be durability. Blockchain, we might be in crypto winter, and there's been fraud, and SBF did this, and there's toxic Bitcoin culture over there, and all of these things. But blockchain isn't going anywhere.
Right.
Just like railroads didn't go anywhere after the speculative bubble the speculative bubbles that emerged around railroads. Like, people were doing, essentially securities frauds to make money for railroads going nowhere. And there was a whole giant crazy ordeal with that. But railroads transformed Western society. They shortened the distance between places. They allowed goods and services and people to flow back and forth more quickly, transformed society fundamentally.
And when people say, like, yeah, that's all fine, the theory of blockchain being useful for all these other applications, the critique often comes back of like, but I can't really use it for all of these things right now.
No.
And it's like,
just like you couldn't use a railroad. I mean, if you saw a couple of lines that were connecting a couple of cities, that didn't mean that you could get from New York to San Francisco.
Right.
Of course not. Right. There's a bunch of work that has to happen.
And you couldn't invest in supply chains to start, creating more railroad cars and fitting your container ships into those cars to ship goods reliably. All of this kinds of development of infrastructure around the rails themselves also takes a lot of time.
And in defense, and we can get into this, but in defense of speculation, which is a mess, and many eggs are broken in the creation of the omelet. But in defense of speculation, it is currently how our society acknowledges that there's a big potential. And people get excited and they get emotional and they take a big risk and they put money in, and then that inflates the bubble, and then there's all this liquidity going around, and some small amount of it is, a bunch of it's being used for whatever the heck people are using it for, and some small amount is going to build the enterprises that create the durable, lasting transformation that then emerges into, fast forward 150 years, and we have global supply chain system with, standards around container size and rail systems and trucking systems and all of those things. And the seeds of that were planted and born in these successive market bubbles, basically, in these speculative frenzies in which people were throwing money in, and there were bad actors, but there were also good actors. And I don't know what the percentages are. It'd be interesting to find out, and like for somebody to do a thorough historical analysis of the relationship between speculative bubbles and what's durable later. Right. And like, side note, I'm not claiming that type of speculation and sort of like capitalist approach to building out the future is the best way, right, or the only way. Another, often used quote is, it just is the least bad way we have available right now. And if there was like a rigorous and earnest proposal for a different way of coordinating human attention to do the kind of big work that's being asked of us right now, and we haven't even gotten to this sort of like planetary situation and the social and cultural situation that we're in as a species. But it's big, it's important, and it requires us to coordinate ourselves, transform our society, transform our infrastructure, transform culture, and reconnect to be a regenerative keystone species on the planet. That's a huge coordination undertaking.
And we don't have that many decades.
And we don't have a huge amount of time. And if there's a better way, a better proposal than kind of like markets, I am all in. I'll show up to the meetings. I'll put my time in. I'll put my resources in to helping make it happen. I'll roll my sleeves up and support. But I don't see anyone proposing actual sort of like, there's no invitation. I don't have an invitation. Like, and let's just be clear, sort of like intervening with harm and being an activist to slow down destruction and degradation is honorable and good, and people should be applauded for it. And those of us who are trying to work on sort of the Aikido of flowing the energy of this crazy market behemoth and funneling it back into right relationship with Earth are on your side as activists. We're not on a different side. We're not trying to sort of like pull a fast one, right? And so
before you go on, I mean, outside of the point between kind of market approaches versus a different way, I think you're pointing to something when you say like, I didn't get that invitation. Yeah, I don't have that invite. You're pointing to another characteristic of blockchains, which is this kind of permissionless ability for people to actually have agency in this open source context to build something, to do something. Like I think a lot of folks, especially on the younger side, look at the situation and they're like, what do I do? And we don't have a culture where, you know, again, crude generalization, but where it's really been that attractive for intelligent people to go into civic politics and become a political leader.
Totally.
Like,
but it should happen.
I've never wanted to be a congressman, right? And like, because I'm like, that just looks like a complete shit show. Like, I don't want to have that be my life, right? And but you know, it should actually be like a career that's heralded as like honorable and important, you know, to go into political office or go into some sort of civic leadership or community service in public institutions. And we don't have that right now. So there's something also, I think, important about this kind of, you know, renegade on the forums, on the internet, in the gamer, you know, chat rooms, like this ability, like anyone can participate. And, you know, I don't really feel that in other aspects of our society to make change and to affect change.
It's a great point. And like, side note, yes, we should all get over the allergy to participation in civil society, and we should use the political checks and balances and levers of change to support enacting the transformation, 100%. And we should realize that system has been bought and sold several times by market forces. So you can't naively walk in and just like think that getting a bunch of people elected and changing regulation will do it all.
Right.
You have to have, I mean, we just need this plurality,
Totally.
You know, like Paul Hawkins' Blessed Unrest. Like, you just need all of these people working and doing different things in different places. And one of those places, and it isn't the way, but it is an important way, is transforming markets and re-embedding markets into relationship with commons and planet and the sacred even. And I would say my work, and I get so sad, and I probably take it much too seriously, but I get so sad at the gulf that I feel with, you know, like the Indigenous Environmental Network sort of type of like, hey, carbon markets are evil, speculation is evil. This is all just a value extraction neo-colonial process, and it's all bad. And if you participate in it, you're complicit in the evil perspective. Makes me very personally very sad. I will admit that markets and speculation, it's like there are hazards. There are mini hazards. There are also mini hazards, though, about dogmatic, fundamentalist activism, in which you see the world as like good and evil, black and white, and you create a fight against, there's also a bunch of hazards. So we can like go back and forth and point out the hazards of different approaches. And I think it's really, what's really, I think, enlivening is to think of a community of people that can have a respectful conversation and hold each other accountable to navigating the hazards instead of falling into the sort of like polarization trap, because that's MULOC. Like what MULOC wants is for us to be fighting each other instead of harmonizing our agency with one another for the deeper regeneration quest that needs to happen. Right. Because, for instance, like just go to Regen Network. Regen Network needs independent activist input on credits that are being created, on these symbolic representations of ecological regeneration that have a market, right? So we should do our Carbon 101 and Ecosystem Service Markets 101 probably, because we've been deep in the weeds.
And before we get there, if I could just prolong us in the weeds for a moment, I think there's also just something to be said about, I mean, you're kind of defending not necessarily the merits of markets, but just pointing to the pragmatic way in which they shape society.
Yeah.
And I would also say another angle of like resistance I feel here is the feeling that this is techno-utopian, that this is yet another gadget, yet another tool, and this promise and this quest of that we're somehow going to invent our way out of this mess, and a recognition that like often that is not the answer.
That's a valid critique. I mean, look, all of the critiques and restraints come from super valid places. I think that's one thing that I want people to hear. It's like speculation can hurt people and it can be bad. It's also a thing that exists, and we have to be pragmatic and sort of like engage with it, I think. Not just be like, oh, it's bad and therefore nothing, but instead, how do we sort of like link that into regeneration? Technological innovation and tinkering, and I mean, you can create castles in the sky and have it be disconnected with landscapes. And also, I think it's unarguable that sort of human ingenuity and technological innovation has a dynamic relationship with the evolution of culture. So culture evolves tools and tools evolve culture. And centering in our ethical framework for approaching technology, centering just sort of like good old-fashioned Aldo Leopold. What's good for the land is good. So there's a lens. Is this technology creating good for the land? And we can expand that and, sort of have a more holistic understanding of the bioterritorial cultural relationship between humans and a place and the soil and the watershed. And we can ask, is this technological innovation reconnecting us with our regenerative custodial role at the planetary level and at an ecosystem level, or is it not? And that's a really fruitful conversation, and we should have those conversations. And I would be the first person to say that there's a bunch of technology or a bunch of technological rabbit holes that definitely probably don't pass the
Right.
the sniff test.
Right. Right.
You're like, oh, that's not actually getting us there.
Yeah.
However, if you get back to my definition of blockchain as a social technology, fundamentally, we're weaving together a network of computers, programming in a set of rules. That's actually a collectivization process. It's a coordination process. If we're able to link that digital technology to create consensus about ecological health, what exists now, what we want to exist, and what we're going to need to do to invest in our ability as a community to coordinate and take those actions. To me, that is really clearly a package of technology that enables a leap in our ability to coordinate to regenerate.
Right. Okay, there's a lot more we can say about ethics and philosophy and all those topics, but we wanted to get into kind of a bit of ground leveling carbon markets 101.
Yeah.
And you have such great articulations. So maybe just help us understand the landscape and the foundations here.
Yeah. So again, first I'll start with the disclaimer that carbon markets are imperfect and there may be some really viable solutions outside of market mechanisms that should be explored.
Right.
And carbon markets, I believe, can be a pretty powerful tool for actually fundamentally transforming the way that economics works and even how we conceive of, I guess, capitalism and the role of money and the role of the firm or the corporation in society. And it is actually, I think, should be understood and honored for the pretty fundamental leap that's taking place. And kind of like, it's actually really radical. And I think we should have I think for any good conversation about carbon markets, to sort of understand in some ways just how radical it is and how exciting it is to be at a moment in history where the fabric of, I guess, extractive capitalism is being regenerated, or it's like being dissembled and reassembled in real time from the outside in and from the inside out. And that there's like this converging set of forces. And I don't say this as a hand wavy fan of, corporate sustainability, corporate social responsibility, environmental social governance, ESG, impact investing, carbon markets, all of them, that whole sort of like bundle of things has its issues, and it's actually quite radical. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about the idea that carbon emissions be counted as a liability on the balance sheet of a corporation. So taking a step back, corporations are legal persons that have huge amounts of power in the world. They're usually have a board of directors. There's different sort of structures, but generally there's like shareholder voting. So you vote with your money. You have a there's representation, sort of a representative system on the board, and then the board is hiring executives. And executives are held responsible for what? They're held responsible for the company making more money and expanding and growing. And we can critique that, and we should. And we should also be working on reinventing legal structures and corporate structures, and maybe somebody's busy trying to like revoke corporate personhood and reform corporate charter law, and more power to you. That's amazing. We should do those things. And in that construct, if that doesn't change, right, all things being equal, if that doesn't change, reflecting carbon emissions, and this is the Trojan horse for all negative externalities, That is to say, the negative impacts that a corporation has while making money, reflecting that onto the balance sheet as a liability, as a money liability, totally transforms leadership, decision making, and the nature of what a company is. Because all of a sudden, a company is becoming responsible as a social coordination mechanism for something beyond just making its shareholders money. And that's actually pretty radical. And again, there's different ways to think about that. And we should be doing all of them. But that one should be applauded, I believe, should be applauded for what it is, which is a radical shift to change what companies are doing. And I think there's so much pushback against carbon markets. And the big critiques are it's just a license to pollute, right? And there should be reparations instead of carbon payments. So let's take those critiques one by one. It isn't just a license to pollute. Companies don't need a license to pollute. Companies can just pollute if they want to. In most jurisdictions around the world, from a global perspective, nobody's holding companies responsible. Generally speaking, they're profit-making machines. And this is actually a way to shift behavior and to hold them responsible. So is it a license to pollute? Maybe it is a license to pollute with, a set of, then that license is giving you, if it's putting a cost on it, and it's making a set of terms for that pollution can only happen if and when, That's kind of what the market mechanism is doing. So that the civil society actually now, if this continues to evolve and we evolve more sophisticated mechanisms, we have the potential to re-embed, corporate firms have just become this disembodied profit machine that's just abstracting and extracting away all of the living, health and wealth and wholeness of people on the planet, right? That's pretty true. It's also pretty true that they generate extraordinary material abundance that, in fact, most of the critics are enjoying from day to day, from cars and coffee and cell phones and all of those things. So it's sort of, I guess unless you're Amish and they saw all this stuff coming and had a very clear critique against, the English mercantile approach that became the dominant culture, and they sort of set themselves aside. But side note, the Amish also sell a lot of stuff to their neighbors. So it's complicated. So carbon markets, there's two major sections of carbon markets. There's voluntary carbon markets and there's compliance carbon markets.
Before you get into the two sides, you had started with the two critiques. One was the critique that it's a license to pollute. The second, that it should just be reparations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That there should be a full stop, and we should just be calculating damage that's been done by the people involved in degradation and extraction, and that then it should be returned to people and ecosystems who have been damaged.
Why do you think that doesn't work, or that critique falls short?
I think there are no historical examples that I'm aware of in which that action takes place without the group that's demanding reparations having physically and violently taken dominion over the group that is then forced to give reparations. So essentially it's a continuation, or it's a declaration of war. And it's saying it's us versus you, and you owe us. And my sense is, in the history of peace and reconciliation processes, that that isn't a viable path forward. That isn't to say that I don't resonate with the sort of justice and fairness of identifying and supporting land back and different forms of reparations so that communities have their I mean, that you can't be made whole. You can't be made whole when you've been impacted by, I guess, sort of like traumatic and violent extractivism. Right? There's no making that better with like money or something. So there has to be a long process to reweave and rehole and create care. And
I think part of it can be baked into the forward-looking incentive structures as well. And I think there is a role for reconciliation. I think there is a role for like more. We need more of a moment of sitting with the harm and understanding the history and the context in which we're born into, and that we continue to perpetuate in lots of hidden and unseen ways. But it is a strange jump for me to go from that to, but we shouldn't have carbon markets. Like that part of the critique doesn't resonate with me because, again, what we're trying to do is instrument and to create more of a wholeness for the calculus of how the logic of the system is working, which is that these externalities right now have no repercussions. The pollution that's going out has no repercussions. And so if we can bring that into more wholeness and say, no, that is a liability. It's a liability to the commons. It's a liability to all of us. If the ecological health suffers, we all suffer. And so what are those instruments and what are those tools to kind of bring that into right relationship? And that's not to say that we shouldn't still have rules against pollution and other forms of enforcement. And it's also not to say we shouldn't be looking at this through a lens of justice and fairness and right relationship amongst people.
I think it boils down to the critics of carbon markets are allergic to the idea that the same companies who, and maybe even humans, who made enormous, sort of generated an enormous amount of personal private wealth at the expense of the commons, at the expense of indigenous people, at the expense of soil and water and polluted, will make more money because they're positioned to be the leaders in the next carbon speculative market bubble. And then there's...
And I resonate with that, yeah. I mean, it's highly problematic if that's how it goes down.
And, well, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, I'm doing everything I can. My life work for the last 6 years has been to try to create a market infrastructure that can be owned fully and operated fully and governed fully by the supply side of this carbon and biodiversity and sort of living capital marketplace.
What do you mean by that? What is supply side?
Supply side is forest stewards, indigenous people, farmers, scientists, activists, the people who earth tenders, people who directly are caring for the ecosystems that need to be, that our relationship needs to be transformed with those ecosystems in order for those ecosystems to regenerate themselves and to be part of this like bigger puzzle of rebalancing the relationship between humans and the greater than human world, the global biosphere, and repairing the carbon cycle and the hydrological cycle. So, in a very practical sort of like business sense, the supply side of a marketplace for carbon credits that are being sourced from living systems, like the living carbon markets, forests, soils, wetlands, oceans, requires active human stewardship, intervention, and care to make that transformation. And what I'm passionate about is making those vocations anchored in financial abundance through good incentives. So that if you're a young person and you want to make a decision to spend your life repairing riparian zones, or regenerating soil, or creating kelp forests, or doing holistic grazing, or stewarding your ancestral community's forests, you will make a better living than someone who goes off to Wall Street or something.
Right. Or Congress.
Or Congress. That our society shifts its focus and places the value where values do. And that's a social construction of value process. It's an economic process. And, that's what I'm working towards, right? And in order to do that, you have to interact with markets. Because everybody somewhere, and so like taking a step back, what are markets? Markets in some way are ways of having an abstract enough system that different communities can have an interoperable understanding of value. And I think where things get really problematic and challenging is when we impose market logic, we drive it all the way down into a cultural context in which it's not welcome and it's counterproductive, and it actually impinges the ability to have an intact, beautiful human relationship. But even, and yet some market will still exist, and that sort of commons will still in some way be interacting with it. So like in some ways, I think you could describe a healthy relationship between markets and commons as one in which a community managing a commons together can make their own rules for if, how, and when to interact with markets, but they have all those tools at their fingertips, and they're able to sort of self-determine and program in their own internal definition of money, like their own internal symbolic representation of exchange and use and intrinsic and relationship value systems, and program and govern how they interact with other communities who have different understandings.
Totally. Okay, so I took us off on a tangent, but you were going to say the two different types of carbon markets.
So compliance and voluntary. So compliance markets are where the state sort of is forcing that liability of carbon emissions to be with a mandate. And voluntary markets are where companies are opting in to applying that liability on their balance sheet and then offsetting it with carbon credits that have been generated. So it's fully voluntary, and there's not a regulatory framework or compliance process. The voluntary markets are much smaller, but growing fast. The compliance markets are much bigger. So that's sort of like carbon market. That's sort of those are the existing carbon marketplaces, I guess you could say.
And the motivation on voluntary carbon markets, is it mostly companies just want to do the right thing and so they want to be net zero? Is it, if we can declare net zero, then we can put that into our marketing slogan and that helps us with kind of our messaging? Is it, we think the puck is going there and we need to get ahead of the puck because there's going to be compliance mandates? Is it all of the above? Like, what's your felt sense?
It's all of the above. Plus, I think it's a genuine growing understanding amongst corporate leadership and shareholders that, the ability of their money to make more money is contingent upon an inhabitable biosphere.
Turns out.
And that it starts to therefore become corporate responsibility
Right.
to take that action, just from a just utilitarian
Survival.
homo economicus.
Yeah.
We're running a firm, we want our firm to survive, to keep doing what it's doing. We're going to need to start to be on this. And then enters in this sort of strategic advantage. Okay, we can see we've come to this conclusion. It's likely that other people will also come to this conclusion. This is like the way the market trends are going to go. That means if I'm aggressive in this and I actually am one of the first ones and I pre-buy my carbon supply, maybe I can actually make profit from my transition. And that, I believe, is like the fervor and the hype around carbon and the big influx of VC capital over the last 18 months or so. It was a big peak like 6 months ago. There was just a ton of stuff happening. The macroeconomic conditions after that. So in my interactions with investors and business leaders and thought leaders, I feel like there is sort of this consensus that if capitalism doesn't internalize the negative externalities as costs, but also start to create value or assets out of positive externalities, like achieving a net zero goal or protecting a forest, then, capitalism is going to kill itself. And the thing about capitalism and markets is that when everybody just starts thinking a thing, there's sort of like this herd mentality, and it just starts to be, you start to get this ferment and you start to create this speculative approach, and then it sort of becomes kind of like a runaway train. And it's like it's going to go that direction, whether individuals like it or not, or whether it's good or bad. But generally speaking, and this is an interesting argument, and maybe it's sort of, post hoc and whatnot, but generally speaking, it seems like that collective intuition that manifests itself into weird market manias is usually pointed at something that's real.
Right.
And again, it's not to say that it happens responsibly or couldn't happen better.
Right.
But it's generally speaking, it's pointed at something that's real. And so again, back to Regen Network, I think, this like larger lens, from my perspective, the question isn't whether this is good or bad. From my perspective, the question is, how do we make something that is now becoming an inevitable sort of like herd market process as regenerative and as good as possible?
And I think that for me has been my guiding intuition around crypto. Was I found Bitcoin 2013-ish, whatever, and I remember thinking, I have no idea if this is good. I have no idea if it's going to work. But God, the humans are going to love it.
Yeah.
And at some point, it's going to be a bubble, because it just tugs on all of the right parts of the psyche and the herd capitalist markets thing. So let me throw a little bit of money into it and see what happens.
Yeah.
And, it's very selfish. I'm contributing to the problem if it is bad, whatever. But like, that was just my psychology at the time. And then when it went through a bubble, or like 2017, and I was like, I had this experience with a personal trainer, and I was working out, and he was letting me know that he was probably going to retire in 18 months because of all the crypto tokens, and, this much is going to pay off, and da-da-da. And I was like, it's time to get rid of my Bitcoin. Like, this is a bubble. I don't know. There's nothing real about it, and I got rid of it. And fast forward to being on the farm in New Zealand and, thinking that moving to New Zealand and working on regenerative land projects, that somehow I was going to have something to contribute to like advancing the ecological understanding of whatever, water catchment systems or reforestation systems or farming or whatever. And one, my experience is like I didn't have that much to contribute in those realms. But two, like we kind of already know what to do. Like we collectively understand a lot, but all the time where the rubber meets the road is really just a question of economics.
Yeah.
And the farms and farmers and foresters and so forth often want to do the right thing, and they can't because the constraints of this current way that we financialize the system is just not compatible with these regenerative actions without a heroic amount of effort, but it's usually like an above and beyond amount of effort. The people who are making it all work and regenerating the land and so forth are like these unicorns working 100 hours a week, giving themselves to the land. And so I'm left with this feeling sense of like, I don't know what's right, but it just feels like that we have to work on this, and we have to recognize that like this is a key part of the challenge and the constraint. And I don't feel like I can somehow reshape all of culture overnight, but like we have to change the way money works in relationship with the land. And this is what the humans are doing right now. Like they're using money, they're using markets, whatever we want to call it. And we're operating on this operating system. We're using this tool set of symbolic exchange and value exchange. And so can we change that? And for me, like crypto and blockchain is like just the most exciting, disruptive, huge transformational force in that paradigm, in that logic. It doesn't mean it's all good by any stretch, but at the very least, permissionlessly, in a decentralized manner, a whole bunch of us can start to work on this system to try to create new rules and new leverage points.
Yeah. I mean, so I resonate with all of that. And going back to my definition of blockchain is it's a social computer. You could think of Regen Network as we're trying to create an eco-social computer. We're trying to connect a social computing system that allows us to govern a set of parameters that are economic, social, and scientific in a way that regenerates landscapes. So we can make agreements between each other. We can create symbolic representation of our success or failure. We can generate money that's sourced from those actions. We can program in and experiment with incentives so that we transform that, so that people can work 30 hours a week or 60 if they want, because they're having a great time and have a great livelihood for getting out there and doing ecoforestry. That's the mission. Like that's right. And going back to the watershed metaphor, I believe that creating the idea has been that the nodal intervention, or like getting way up in the watershed with your trowel, is to kind of create an open source, replicable model that is complete enough that it can serve for groups of humans to a critical mass of humans to engage with it, to actually opt into a new system in which the social consensus about value is deeply linked to ecological health. And that identity and culture, value, wealth, status all starts to be sourced from the cooperative endeavor of regenerating an ecosystem, and that there's clear ways to experiment with that, and that the effort put into that in the crazy world, if that, like Bitcoin did, became a viral market meme, right? And people like started jumping in and engaging with it, that would be the equivalent of catching the energy way high up in the watershed and sinking it in before it's doing massive, erosive, destructive damage as that capital is just like flooding through, right? Totally. And so, thinking about in the context of Regen Network, we endeavor to be allies to indigenous people in navigating their indigenous nations in navigating the questions that arise when thinking about the really complicated situation that they're in as land stewards in a, mercantile, market-driven system that is different from their cultures, which have succeeded in stewarding many of the most important ecosystems for thousands of years. And now they find themselves in a situation in which this like runaway train of speculative fervor and, hey, every person, every tech bro and finance bro in the world is like, oh, we could fix climate change with like a token or a natural capital company or whatever, right? Everybody it's the zeitgeist, it's the gestalt, it's the groupthink of the moment. So they find themselves essentially sitting, as has happened historically many times before, sort of like sitting on the metaphorical gold mine, right? And there's restraint amongst that community because this isn't their first rodeo, so to speak.
Right.
This has happened before.
Right.
People have been pushed off.
Right.
The conservation community and environmentalist community has had a really poor track record of interfacing with the fact that people inhabit landscapes and can be forces of regeneration and good and do enclosures and processes. So that's all fact, right? But what's interesting is, from my perspective, the only way that we have a symbolic representation that is good enough to coordinate a regenerative transformation of society is if we deal with that tension right now at the beginning of the foundation of the marketplace. And that goes back to what I was saying is I guess the theory at Regen Network is if you have the market apparatus, the full market apparatus owned and operated by land stewards, indigenous people, scientists, and activist groups, that are supplying the regenerative transformation, the living carbon outcomes, the hydrological outcomes, and the biodiversity outcomes, instead of the demand side of the marketplace, which is speculative capital trying to capture the demand and then run a speculative bubble and extract as much value out as possible. That's how that works. But if you build a system that's owned and operated fully and governed fully by sort of a cooperative network of people, it's like unionizing. So you could think of what Regen Network is trying to do is unionizing carbon markets.
Right. So you said a lot there. I want to unpack a few distinctions. Like if a corporation, let's say an airline, wants to go offset some of its emissions, whether it's for compliance reasons or voluntary reasons, and so it goes to, a landowner and says, okay, great, I want to buy carbon credits from this forest effort. That's a different demand side buyer of those carbon credits than if a Wall Street, bank fund manager says, oh, I think carbon markets are probably poised to pop. The chart says the line went through a head and shoulders pattern, and now I think it's going to go up. And so I want to go buy a bunch of carbon. And that demand side buy pressure is for the purpose of this speculative reason that you cited, which is that they're looking for a resaleability.
They think, exactly. And they're speculating on the fact that there will be more demand from those airlines and all of those other companies.
Totally. And what you're saying is that this tension, which is exemplified in indigenous communities, for example, where they are needing to interface now with the mercantile logic of these carbon markets. And it turns out that indigenous nations and communities and tribes all over the world steward some of the most biodiverse lands as well.
From
as
this lens, all of the most
lands.
valuable places.
Right.
And so the relationship of exchange, the relationship of contract can be respectful. It can be in right relationship. It can be regenerative, or it can be extractive. It can be degenerative. And, we can see a replication of divide and conquer,
Right.
or we could see something different. And we'll probably see both. I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's going to be a messy, complex unfolding.
Yeah. And so how do we ensure that the development of these carbon markets, and we haven't even talked too much about, that there's other ecological
Yeah.
ecosystem services represented by different, whether it's tokens or credits and certificates, et cetera. How do we ensure at this stage of development that the trajectory of this honors that the governance is really held in sovereignty by those land stewards, whether there's indigenous peoples over their lands or whether it's the farmer or the forester? Is that what you mean by supply side?
Yeah. And there's two levels to that. So one is, I believe that it means anchoring the process of creating the credit in the community. This is a very radically different approach than the existing carbon market standards, in
Right.
which there's sort of a group from the top down of
Yep.
expert scientists who sort of like isolate themselves and then declare that this is the standard
Mm-hmm.
that the market can use.
Mm-hmm.
And that has its own problems. And we're seeing many of the problems that are intrinsic to that model happen now with the fierce critiques and shaking of confidence in carbon markets due to, what happens when that's the approach is you get different factions of scientists fighting over each other or with each other about what's real, because it's complicated, because baseline stuff is complicated, it's all these other things. And you get sort of like backroom incentives mostly guiding the political or sort of like news cycle battles that are then either creating confidence or creating doubt, right? So that's a whole way, and that's the way that the carbon markets are currently
Right.
working.
Right.
But there's a different way, and that different way is to have open tools, capacity and capability and fluency amongst the stewardship community itself to build alliances to generate and basically say, hey, if there's going to be a market, here is our offering. This is the deal. Here's what we're willing to do. And here's what it means, and here's how we're proving that we're completing the deal.
Right.
And to be able to have a little bit more experimentation around that, rooted in culture and rooted in place, and allowing that to all coexist on a larger marketplace that is owned and operated by those same communities, so that you have sort of like a much more pluralistic, open, market system that isn't free, because you're encoding the ability for people to govern their own terms and services and relationships.
Right.
And also potentially set larger, I guess you could say, like self-regulatory rule sets, right? And encode all of that in a way that then you can also program the currency system that's being used. You can start to program using governance all of these different layers and start to create a durable system. That's the vision. And it's what's happening, right? So Regen Network has come a long way since 2017. So there's a marketplace, there's a registry system, there are groups going through the process of defining their own credit standards, and there are groups sort of self-governing that process. And right now we're in the process of really getting this like nested governance of economic parameters and standards spun up right now. And
We had a great conversation with Sam Bennett, one of their product managers.
Yeah.
And people can watch that to get into the real nitty gritty of how the registry works.
yeah, exactly. So, and there's been all sorts of controversy and challenges, right? Because we made the decision to support legacy carbon credits, despite kind of being on team critique legacy carbon credits myself, the larger theory that we're taking is that we want to respect an individual group's ability to define their own process and say, this is what's valuable.
Right.
And we would include the legacy system in that. Right. And so from my perspective, once you start like throwing the hammer down on different groups, you're sort of playing this whack-a-mole game where you're like, you know, like what if an indigenous community says we want a credit that represents a qualitative traditional ecological knowledge system that has no science, and it's a, you know, no Western science, and it's a council that's holding youth accountable for, you know, like ancestral regeneration practices, and they want to create a whole sort of like symbolic representation that can't be secondary traded. It just gets purchased and retired, and it's a way of supporting them and sort of like rebuilding. Wow, that'd be awesome, right? But you know, if you start getting to the system where the network is like passing judgment on which one is like acceptable and which one isn't acceptable,
the ivory tower, you know,
you
panel.
recreate
Right.
this like expectation that someone can. So so that's why I've been restrained around like excluding even things that I don't think are the best. Right.
So what you're saying is there's been previous carbon credits where they've top-down methodologies and kind of legacy.
Yeah, and they have problems.
And they have problems, but the vision of Regen Network is where you're much more of an agnostic protocol, or you're more of a permissionless protocol, where people can come in with their own credit classes, and this spans well beyond carbon.
Yeah.
So there might be a biodiversity credit class, or there might be a water catchment class.
Or a traditional ecological knowledge credit class, or
coral reef restoration over here. And like, because that recognizes local context matters, and that we live in a world that's beyond carbon, right? Like, it's like, so we're using these kind of crude starting terminology like carbon markets, and people have one preconceived notion of what that is. But what we're describing is really ecological services, ecological health,
ecological benefits
being represented on a shared ledger, a shared communications protocol platform network, and that enables a degree of trust and coordination and a velocity of trading and verifying and, you know, researching and validating and so forth, using these things called blockchains and ledgers
to ensure that we're not just recreating the sort of like centralized ivory tower problem, and that we're really creating a pluralistic, open space to root this new economic primitive, this new economic base building block, which, in order to realign economics with social health and ecological health, I believe we need a new economic building block. And that economic building block needs to be flexible, pluralistic, and experimental, because fundamentally I believe it's a basic human right for a particular cultural group, like a society, to define its own monetary system. Because monetary systems are the artifact of culture, and the hegemony of a specific monetary system and a specific symbolic representation, and the idea that is money, instead of there being many monies, there being many currencies that are specifically programmed and governed by groups to express their cultural reality. So that's the worldview. And, you know, and my belief is that in order for us to make this transition to a regenerative economy, to a regenerative society, to a society in which humans are a keystone species on the planet, stewarding a biosphere for the benefit of life, we need to transform our cultural perspective about where value comes from. And this is a very practical, tangible, concrete experimentation with creating a tool set for people to define value as sourced from ecological health. And yeah, we're, practically speaking, we're super focused on like the go-to-market strategy related to carbon markets, because that's currently where the most people are experimenting with, this symbolic representation of ecological health. And as we talked about, that, in that worldview, it's like, oh, we're making carbon a liability, and then we can, carbon offsets or carbon credits can be an asset, and the offset side is a liability. And, okay, well, people, that's a worldview. It's a paradigm. It happens to be the dominant one that is affecting, huge change, and in which, some little temper tantrum of a CEO somewhere could actually end up having downstream effects that destroy people's lives. And, and that sucks. And one experiment to transform that is to create this new idea of, unit value connected to intact cultural ecological relationships. That I would say, like, if I was to define an eco credit, it is a symbolic representation of the right relationship between a group of people and a place. One way that you could unitize that is by quantifying the carbon outcome of that right relationship. And there happens to be a big market for that. And as you said, there's a new emerging market around biodiversity. There's going to be a very big market for that. But also, we need to sort of be holistic and understand that that this is much bigger than like a single reductionistic unit. And that's part of the theory of change. So taking a like sharp right turn, we live in a world now of artificial intelligence. So another way of thinking about what we're doing is creating a like collective art love poem to Earth that is machine readable and is possible to enchant our new children who are being born right now, silicon-based artificial intelligence.
I hope they're children and not parents.
They are our children. Like, we have responsibility for them. And if we're treating them as slaves and we're trying to extract as much value out of them, it's going to go poorly for everybody involved. If instead we're understanding an opportunity for this like weird emergent process that I believe is connected to life, like this is like life begetting life in a new, weird, crazy way, it seems to me. And I think we need to be, we need to be singing love songs to Earth. We need to be training and teaching and engaging, and there's no other way I don't believe you can do that with like, hey, here's the universal metric for ecological health, and we've got the satellites and they tell you the metric and it's like one single system. Right. I think that's actually a recipe for it goes exactly the wrong way, because AI and capitalism, which is kind of a weird form of AI, when you get fixated on a single unit, when you get fixated on a single system, it has unforeseen downstream consequences that can be enormously destructive. Whereas if you create sort of a polycentric, pluralistic, multinodal approach, that people in union with digital tools or machines and union with soil and an ecosystem are expressing their own, like going through a creative process to express, again, a symbolic representation of that beautiful set of right relationships. And that can happen all over the place. I think we don't have a lot to fear if that comes to be. We don't have so much to fear with like the paperclip optimizing AI that turns the planet into a paperclip because it was programmed to do it. Because you could have many different, we can be optimizing for like context and place and regeneration in, very specific ways. And the emergent property can be biosphere health without ever having to get the one metric to rule them all.
Gregory, it's So fun to speak with you. I really appreciate your perspectives. I've learned a lot from you. I would encourage people who want to continue to go down these different threads to look at all of the prolific work that you've put out there. You have a podcast. Regen Network is super transparent. You have community calls. There's YouTube channels. There's Discords. On and on. Regen.network is kind of, I guess, the best entryway into your website and into this community. I hope that this is the first of many conversations that we can record, because I think there's a lot that we can continue to unpack. Is there any other final messages or reflections you want to share? And thanks for being with us.
I'm super grateful for the conversation, and I'm excited for the series that you're putting together. And it's gonna, I guess my final message is just really that I think it's going to be the harmonizing of the agency of many different communities and actors to really ask the question, what does regen or regeneration mean to us, and how do we represent that? And that's not an easy thing. You know, you can't just snap your fingers. I don't think GPT could probably do it for you yet. But it's a beautiful process, and it can actually sort of like fuse this moment that we're in, I believe, in this, in a really meaningful quest for what is the right relationship between myself as an individual, this community of people that I live with, and the place that we live, and how would we represent that to the world, and what sort of and what do we want out of that representation? And if those are questions that people are inspired to ask and engage with, as you said, Regen Network has a pretty amazing community of people who are asking and engaging with those questions in scientific ways, in creative ways, in artistic ways. And my hope is that it really starts to swell and become an opportunity for deep exploration about what regeneration means in different contexts.
Well said. Thank you, Gregory.
Thank you.
All right, what'd you think? I so appreciate Gregory's influence in this space, especially for anchoring the discussions around ethics and integrity. You can learn more about Regen Network at regen.network. Also, check out our conversations with Sam Bennett from Regen Network and Austin Wade Smith from Regen Foundation. You can find all of those discussions and more at maearth.com. I'll see you on the next one.